My first real sort of campaign opportunity was the summer after my sophomore year in 2016. I applied to the Hillary campaign and worked there. It worked at the headquarters in Brooklyn that summer. And then in the following summer, I interned for Ralph Northam's campaign for Virginia governor, which was based in Northern Virginia, right across from DC, which is where I'm from. So I was living at home that summer, and then I drove to Utica, New York, a couple times a week for most of my senior year, usually with a fellow Colgate student, and we interned for Anthony Brindisi's successful campaign for New York's 22nd congressional district, and those are all really different experiences. And I've sort of taken them and applied some of the things I learned to some of the sort of more informal volunteer campaign, kind of like activist opportunities that I've sort of been involved in DC with statehood and local races here. And yeah, that's kind of a little overview of my political campaign experience.
Thank you, Andrew. Rachel, you want to just jump in and tell us what you're up to now and how you got there?
Yeah, of course. Well, thank you, Paul. So I graduated from Colgate last May, so in 2019, and I am now a field organizer on the Joe Biden for President campaign, and I've been on the campaign since September. This is my first campaign experience. You'll probably see in my bio, my experiences were more with nonprofits and a government agency, but kind of from those experiences, they all kind of meshed together to realize that, you know, this election is super important, and I wanted to get involved. I honestly didn't know that people like me right out of college could work on campaigns. I thought it was just for like big shot people. But then I saw some people from my high school working on other primary campaigns, and I literally Googled Joe Biden jobs. He came to speak at Colgate a couple of years ago, so that's when I started to like him. But I Googled Joe Biden jobs, and it popped up a field organizer position. I did a little research that is kind of like the entry-level campaign job, and I applied and sent in my resume and moved to Iowa a couple weeks later. And since then, I've been working on the campaign, kind of traveling to a few different states around the country. I'm now home working virtually into the campaign, so it's a little different, but happy to answer any questions more about that later.
Great, thank you, Rachel. So we've got two recent graduates that have, Andrew's worked on a couple campaigns and now in his position with the DC city government, built a lot of, Andrew, can you talk to a little bit about some of the skills or the network? Like, how did you go from the campaign to your current job working for the city?
Yeah, so in between being an intern my senior year on the Brindisi campaign and now working for the DC Department of Transportation, where I community engagement, I worked on the Hill. I interned on the Hill and then worked on the Hill for I guess about a year after graduation. So the transition from campaign work to the Hill makes sense more in terms of the connections you've made, and then the transition from campaign work to what I'm doing now with the DC government and community engagement is, I guess, more in terms of like the connection. There's a better connection in terms of like the skills I learned campaigning, and also just volunteering for campaigns too. I also sort of was involved with I ran the Colgate for Hillary group, and that involved a lot more, I guess, sort of like field organizing, like canvassing, knocking on doors and things like that, which is kind of more applicable to my job now. What I do in my job now is I go to a lot of community meetings and sort of local government, like local elected government meetings, and basically like either speak on behalf of the agency and sort of talk about what we're doing in the ward, which includes Capitol Hill, Navy Yard, Southwest, and some other parts of DC, or sort of bringing back important pieces of information to the agency from the community. So that may be, hey, this pothole request was entered by someone, politically important, and we should, just be aware of that when we're deciding how to prioritize our resources and things like that. So, so I think the experiences I've had sort of knocking on doors, interacting with voters either over the phone or in person at like working events, which is something I did a lot on the Brindisi campaign. Those experiences have been really helpful when working for the DC government, because you have to just talk to a lot of people all the time, many of whom don't agree with you or aren't happy with you, or so your employer, and you have to basically be professional, sort of summarize either the campaign or the agency's sort of point in being wherever you are quickly and sort of without going off script. And yeah, I think those skills have been really applicable. Going from campaign work to the Hill was a little bit more sort of about who on the campaign could get me a coffee with someone who was working in a Senate office, who could connect me with someone else who was hiring or whatever. And that was sort of more about the networking, but yeah.
Right. Rachel, you're jumping back a little bit to from the time you applied and got the offer, how many days until you found yourself in Iowa?
I think it was the end of the summer. So I interviewed in August, and I think like 2 weeks later, I drove out to Iowa from New Jersey. So it was a pretty quick turnaround. But I think that's another thing I wanted to touch on, especially with the presidential. I think if you can get involved in a primary, it's really important, and you kind of take a bet on a candidate that you believe the most in, and you're kind of at that point set up for a year of being on that campaign. But it's so in some ways I think I got lucky that I chose the candidate that would end up being the nominee, but in other ways it was a chance. I didn't know if I would just have the job for 5 months or not, and that was a risk I was willing to take.
I would say if you had worked on the Warren campaign or the Sanders campaign, there's a good chance that the winning candidate does pick up a lot of people from other ones. When you got out to Iowa, what were some of the first things that you did, and had you ever been to Iowa before?
No, I had never been to Iowa before. I think the furthest in the Midwest I was Ohio, which I've heard is a debate if it's the Midwest or not. So yeah, I moved out there, and the whole state was split up into, I think, 8 different regions, and our region was Northwest Iowa. So we were super spread out, a lot of farmland. And I got there, and I thought I was going to be in Sioux City, Iowa, because that's where my boss worked. And he was like, nope, we're sending you to Fort Dodge. And I manned an office totally by myself. Sometimes I wouldn't see any of my colleagues for a couple weeks. So it was a lot of learning on the job. I wasn't a political science major, so a lot of it was I had to do a lot of my own work, and I was always asking my boss for questions, always asking my colleagues for questions. But I've learned so much, and just talking to voters, talking about what their issues are, farming policy, agriculture. I didn't know anything about that, and learned so much from then. But I guess what you do right away when you get there as a field organizer, you want to learn about your community. We use a software called Vote Builder, and you kind of just end up calling through people in the community, asking them who they're supporting, if they'll support your candidate. Can you sit down at a coffee shop to learn about your candidate? And you kind of grow that way. And eventually, Iowa is a caucus state, so it's a little different than a primary. We have to recruit what we call precinct caucus captains. So the whole idea is to form these really strong relationships with community members and get them to bring their neighbors to the caucus for Joe Biden or whoever it may be. So it's a lot of relationship building. Your best friends become the elderly folks in the town you live in. So it's a different experience, but it was a lot of fun. So.
Thanks. Hey, Andrew, you were involved with the Brindisi campaign, and obviously we've had Colgate students involved with Claudia's Tenney's campaign in the past. how did you get involved with that campaign while you were at Colgate?
So the person, the person who co-ran the Colgate for Hillary sort of group on campus with me when I was a sophomore and she was a senior was hired. Erica Borsak was hired to be, I believe, the finance director on that campaign. There were a couple staff. I think the campaign manager was also Colgate alum, a little bit older. And so I knew Erica from working together to try to get Colgate students excited about Hillary's campaign. And it just sort of made sense that I had a car on campus. I was fortunate enough to have the time, and sort of ability to get over there. And I think as soon as she found out she was going to be working on that campaign, she reached out to me and said, was interested, wanted to see if I was interested in helping out, even remotely. But going over there was also possible, so I was able to do that.
You've been involved in a number of local races here in the DC area during the summer. So how did you, for instance, get involved with the Northrop campaign in Virginia?
Yeah, that was much more of a just applied online and then followed up by emailing specific people that I could figure out were already working on the campaign. So that race, there was a primary, there was a Democratic primary in mid-June, and it ended up not being close, but sort of the narrative was that it could go either way. And so I was abroad at the time. I was abroad that spring, and so I applied to both campaigns and got in contact with someone who worked on each campaign. That was easier on the campaign that ended up losing because of a Hillary connection. Someone who I had directly interned for was working on that challenger race. And then I got home the day of the primary, found out who won, and then sort of sent an email the next morning being like, hey, if there's still, now that you've won, if you're sort of, because both campaigns basically said, let's talk after the primary. We think you can get intern here, but let's just wait until the primary is over. And so as soon as it was over, I was basically able to come in on Monday and start the internship. But I mean, the point is, that was one where you basically, you have to apply online. You have to Google Ralph Northam jobs, Joe Biden jobs, or whatever. It sounds simple, but you should do that. And then you should do some internet sleuthing. I think we've all gotten good at that, right? And sort of figure out who works for who you might have a connection with that you can sort of use in an email as a reason for emailing them beyond just sort of another kind of cold, hey, I applied, but I'm also waving my hand at you separately. And just sort of be persistent. Follow up if they don't respond, because they usually just missed it because of how many emails they're getting, not because they don't care or sort of don't want to respond.
Right. I think that's important. During the summer, we're depending on, I asked a couple of you what states you're in. New York, for instance, has its primaries on a week from today. And if you're in Westchester, Long Island, I think we know who the candidates are in a couple places, but there are a lot of interesting races that are going to be decided then. And if you honestly, if you showed up at the campaign office in some of those, and I'm happy to talk about specific races or touch base with me offline, they'll put you to work. You could be on the phones, making calls, going out to polling places next Tuesday. I mean, this is something that, especially in this environment, and I'd love to hear some thoughts from Rachel on that. I mean, I've, campaigning is hand-to-hand combat usually, and it's obviously much more exclusively online and on phone right now. But young people, as Rachel was saying, are a key component of this. One, because you have a lot of energy, and two, because you're cheap or free. So take advantage of that. But Rachel, tell me, what are your voter contact? What kind of, as a outreach coordinator, what are your daily tasks that you're conducting now in a coronavirus environment?
Yeah, definitely. So, like I said, we use a software called Vote Builder. So, access to voter records is public information. So we have names and phone numbers, and we have a data team that creates a list for us every day. So some days, right now, I'm working virtually into Texas. So some days we're just calling, people who have donated to the campaign or people who are registered Democrats, and I usually start my day with that list, and it's really just making cold phone calls. It's asking them what's important to them, if they're supporting the vice president, and then from there, hoping that they'll be a volunteer leader themselves. So my whole job is to empower other volunteers to basically do what I'm doing, but on a volunteer level. So then, I have volunteers will organize phone banks, or volunteers will organize Canvas launches. And so my whole job is to organize a group of volunteers to do that work. And yeah, just going off of what Paul and Andrew were saying, I think it's so important to get involved in any way you can in a race. I know, volunteering on a campaign, I think, is the best way to have people know who you are, especially the consistent volunteers who come in every week just for a phone bank session. They know your face, and when a job opening happens, I know at least in Iowa, a bunch of our fellows ended up being onboarded to full-time positions. So I think that's an awesome way to get involved. Right now, I think a lot of campaigns are remote, so even if you're not in a battleground state or whatnot, there are a ton of local races, or you can still get involved in battleground state from New York or wherever you may be.
Yeah, even recently. So I have a full-time job that's not a campaign job right now or anything like that, but I care about politics and about local politics in DC. Just got a plug. It was just announced today that there's going to be a vote on DC statehood in the House on June 26th, and it'll probably be the first time a chamber of Congress ever endorses or votes for DC statehood. So get excited for that. But there was a very contested and sort of like closely watched primary for the DC for a seat on the DC Council that happened a couple weeks ago. I guess 2 weeks ago today, actually. And I basically became much more passionate about the challenger defeating the incumbent over the course of the pandemic, because of a lot of different things that have been happening in DC, in the politics here. And so I just started making phone calls, because it's even gotten a lot easier, even since 2016, when I was kind of in the middle of this, to just make calls on behalf of a campaign online. Like, anyone can really sign up and do this on any level of race. And so I was able to do that basically every evening after work ended, for Janice Lewis George's campaign. And you have to sign up for a training, so that means that you kind of are on a Zoom call with someone who actually works for the campaign, who sort of teaches you how to make calls and what you're supposed to say and not say, and that's a connection. And you can just send them an email saying, thanks so much for the Zoom, like, I made calls today, like, sort of stay in their ear and things like that. So it is really easy just to kind of, and then, like, I put that on my little bio for this thing because it's true. I did volunteer on that campaign for a couple of weeks and make a lot of phone calls. And so you can kind of create that experience, even if no one is really kind of, even if you're not like getting paid or sort of like going to an office or anything like that. It's real if you do it.
Right. I think that's a good point, is that you can do this, if you've got just a night a week, or you want to do this full time, there are now much more effective ways to contribute. And I would say getting that first little piece, if you think this is something that you want to do, trying to find an angle, whether it's just making some calls a few nights a week, will help you build some skills on your resume. So the next time, let's say next summer, you decide this is something you want to do. Or if you're looking for that internship at state capitol or on Capitol Hill, the interest in working on the campaign is something that is a valuable skill. When I was a chief of staff to a member of Congress, I would only hire people with campaign experience. I was always very leery of anyone out of a top school or graduate school that said they wanted to work in policy and had no campaign experience, because that's a recipe for disaster if you don't understand how to connect with the voters. So I would keep that in mind too. I think that's still a very valuable skill to have just that a little bit of time out in the field. And you might find, you have a bug for it and you want to continue. But before we go on here, and please, let's kind of move, if you've got questions, put them in the chat or let us know. But if I could ask the folks on the students, are people interested in getting involved in a campaign right now, or are you thinking about it down the road? Do you have interest in policy areas and looking to build something in the, for a federal government job or something? But we can start to direct this conversation a little bit more. So think about that. I'm going to ask Rachel a question. Rachel, what is the the most entertaining thing that you've been asked to do on the campaign that you share with your friends? Like, I can't believe I had to do this today.
That's a really good question. Voters are so funny and interesting, and especially I was in South Carolina for a couple weeks, and I've never really been to the South before, and it was just the most fun thing, like meeting older voters coming into the office. We would have a phone bank and people would come in without their cell phone because they didn't understand that we don't have like landlines set up. So just the most funny situations ever. In Iowa, we had a few surrogates come. So that would be like Dr. Jill Biden, or it would be a congressman, or we had John Kerry come. And, at that point in Iowa, voters start to get a little burnt out because candidates are always in their faces. So I would knock on a door and I'd be like, John Kerry's coming, like he's coming to our office. And people would be like, I saw him 4 years ago. Or I would be like, you can have a meet and greet with Joe Biden. And people would be like, I've met him 5 times. Because that's just the retail politics that happens in Iowa. So that was a shock to me. I have the funniest stories with our voters and our supporters. They are so dedicated. They come in decked out in their candidates' apparel, and they're always laughing at me and making fun of me. So it's a lot of fun.
Andrew, any good stories that that you remember?
Yeah, the Hillary campaign was really glitzy. I was working in the Brooklyn headquarters, which is a very different experience than being a field organizer and being out of state. I would see kind of like the sort of famous campaign staffers like Huma Abedin and John Podesta and Brian Fallon and these people all the time. And then we'd have these surrogates come in, not even talk to voters, because there weren't any voters in Brooklyn that we were interested in by the time I was working there, at least in the summer. Just to kind of like get the campaign staff fired up. So like Bon Jovi was there, Elizabeth Warren, Congressman Giffords, and Mark Kelly, and a lot of things like that was pretty interesting. I guess another funny, sort of a more kind of funny quick story was I was a communications intern on that campaign, and it was over the summer. We were preparing for the convention, and without getting into any details, there was a day that my supervisor came up to me very like scared looking and was like, I need you to, she like took me over to a trash bin, and it was like this, it was basically like the place where we like would put things that need to get shredded. And she was like, I need you to go through this file, this huge stack of papers, and find anything related to this like topic that I can't speak about. And she was like, you need to take these things out, not say a word to anybody about what's on them. And it was like about vetting for the convention, and like give them to me. And that was a really exciting afternoon. I learned a lot of things that I didn't know, and I sort of, I don't know, I feel like I had some kind of responsibility, but that was kind of a weird entertaining thing that happened to me on the campaign.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of, when you get into the world of politicians, elected officials want us to think that they're just like us, but they're not. I'm going to put Andrew on the spot because he's planning on entering the world of running for office, I hope ready to announce to the world.
Well, not officially. But no, I like on Friday basically. DC, the way the DC government works is there's an elected council that is the legislature, and then below that there's about 200 throughout the city commissioners who basically have no actual authority but are kind of by law supposed to be given great weight in local issues for sort of like neighborhood things, like whether we put a stop sign here or a bike lane there, yada yada yada. And so I'm going to run for basically one of those seats in November, because the current commissioner announced he's running for council, so he can't run again for commissioner. So yeah, I wasn't planning on like talking about this during this thing, but yeah, I'm basically going to be running my own campaign by myself. And wants to help out, let me know. But yeah, I'm going to have to sort of fundraise from my friends, and my network, so that I can pay for things like a website and campaign literature, which is, I guess, the jargony term for mail that we send, that you send voters about your campaign, and things like that. And I'm excited about it. Yeah.
Well, I'm very excited about it too, because we already have several Colgate alumni in the DC government, and as a DC resident, I like to have more people that I can call on as a curmudgeon to complain about rats or garbage pickup and things. So,
well, I'm going to try to be, if there's any Colgate alums in like the 4-block area around the Giant on O Street and Rhode Island Avenue, which would be my district, that'd be great. It's funny how, these things were very small, but like there's always, like we were talking earlier, there's like a Colgate alum working in DC government that I had no idea about. Cool.
So with that, I'll open it up to questions. And again, if you want to get very broad or very specific, like, you live in New Jersey and you want to get involved in a campaign, we're happy to have that conversation. And we do have an extensive network of Colgate alumni in the public policy, state, local, and federal government, and in all the campaign arms as well. So I think there's the initiative has to be on your part to start to build it, but really there's a network here for you to access, and this is a good place to start. So anyone want to jump in with the first question? Winter.
Sorry, can you guys hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So this could be a bit of an open-ended question, but it's just something that kind of sparked curiosity. I know, Mr. Lobo, you had mentioned how there's like such an importance for your hiring to take people who have worked in campaigns, like when it comes to like ultimately maybe going into policy. So I'm just a little bit curious if you guys could each talk about kind of how your knowledge of like public policy and like that whole area is kind of been influenced by campaigning. Just because for me, like I don't fully see the connection, like just because I don't know. So just a little bit curious about that.
Sure, that's an excellent question, and I think I would say there is in the policy political intersection, there is a saying that goes, good politics makes good policy, good policy makes good politics. You could argue the inverse of both of those, but they're intricately connected. And I think one way you see it is, and I would just say at a very high level, is if you're having conversations the way Rachel is, for instance, right now, and you're in Iowa and you're hearing directly from people what's important to them, you basically are able to build some guidelines. You understand how far that you might be able to push a policy before it loses public support. I use a definition of one definition I like of a leader is someone who takes people where they wouldn't go on their own. but you have to lead. They have to come with you. If you try to go there by yourself without understanding how far you can take them, you're going to be lost, and you're not going to be the leader for very long. So I would just say it's having those very personal conversations that Rachel's having right now with people, meeting the blue-haired ladies that come in decked out in probably Joe Biden stuff, like it probably would scare you if they came into your house, and understanding their level of passion, but what's their connection to this candidate, what's going to keep them involved, versus what would Joe Biden have to do to turn them off and then lose their support. So I'll let Andrew and Rachel talk about that. Rachel's hasn't done the policy making part, but she's hearing about it.
Well, Winter, I think your question, I think what I heard in your question is like, because like, this is a question I had, is will I learn what about policy I like, or which issue I care about from doing campaigns? If that was kind of your question, yeah, at least for me, the answer is no. There are a lot of skills you learn that are kind of shared, but I really don't. I think there's a chance that, for example, like I was a communications intern, which meant that I was writing I was like literally writing a lot of messaging tweets, one pagers, things like that about different policies. And I sort of got to, just sort of like read that kind of stuff a lot, but sort of the critical thinking you're doing while you're doing that is much more about how to message it, not like what it actually is. Which may lead you to be like, hey, writing about, Secretary Clinton's, views on healthcare is sort of what's going to get me kind of interested in that topic. But for me, that wasn't the case. My like policy interests developed really rapidly, sort of separate from my campaign work. I basically, during my senior year at Colgate, I became really interested in transportation and housing policy, and sort of urbanism, and then that kind of like I sort of followed that interest on my own time until I realized that I cared about it enough to sort of make it work, like make it my job. And so that sort of really happened separately from my campaign experience.
Rachel, anything to add on that, or at this time?
Yeah, just quickly, I think something cool for me as a field organizer on the campaign is I've learned so much about the other departments. So I've learned that there's a policy team and a political team. Like I would think that those are just the same things, but the political team is the one getting our endorsements, reaching out to our surrogates, all of that. And the policy team is coming up with, okay, what are the bullet points about what our candidate believes in? And then the communications team is, okay, and how do we message those bullet points in a way that voters actually care about? And those are all things that I wouldn't really understand if I wasn't a field organizer. Like the way we talk about things and our messaging is directly related to what voters care about. Like they don't necessarily care about the things that the media might think that they care about, like what the candidate maybe is wearing or whatnot. Those all matter, but voters on the ground, they want to know how's this candidate going to change my life? Like how are they going to help me? And like that's the number one thing that I wouldn't know if I wasn't a field organizer. And, if one day I work in communications or policy or political, I feel like I know what voters care about, and that's helped me a lot.
Thank you, guys.
Other questions from students? Otherwise, we'll chat about some other things, but just raise your hand or online or through the chat. One of the things that I think you experience on a campaign is that, if there are a number of great books on presidential campaigns, but there's a sense that the candidate is always running a marathon and the staff is running a sprint, right? And I think the intensity, if you're a competitive person and you like an intense work environment, there's a lot to enjoy about a campaign, and it's just fun too. And if you have, again, I would say if you have any inkling that you want to do it, you're at the point in your lives that it's a good thing to do. It's a very low risk. You can go out there, you can have a great time. If that person goes on to embarrass themselves in some way, shape, or form, and you don't want to be associated with them, you can take their name off your resume. You never have to put it on your resume. You might decide that today you're you feel you have one ideology and your ideology changes for any reason, then you can not put these things on your resume going forward. So I think that's why it's a good time to do it. But there are questions about, Andrew's got a lot of state and local experience. I've done federal and a lot of local races in New York. Rachel's has a very active role in a national campaign. There's another piece to this, and which will be different this year, but conventions normally need a lot of volunteers. They're a lot of fun. God knows what they're going to look like in Milwaukee and now Charlotte/Jacksonville for the Republicans. But that's another place if you live close to one of those cities, and those are, I would say, also there's a nonpartisan role at those conventions, because they have host committees. So if you're a Republican and you live in Milwaukee, you can work for the host committee, which is just how do we throw a good party and a good event that makes money for Milwaukee, and vice versa. So there are different components in places that you can get some experience. I used to go to every convention. They were a ton of fun. You wouldn't sleep for 4 days, and I just don't know what they're going to be like this time. They're probably going to be very subdued and not as much fun, but also a good learning experience. So that's another area in the political world that you could engage in. Again, we have people working, Colgate alumni working both conventions. Rachel, anything that you're doing, tell me the states you were in: North Carolina, Iowa,
Nevada. So I was in Las Vegas knocking on doors, which probably sounds crazy. I was in Illinois and Kansas City, Missouri, and now working virtually into Texas. And then soon I think I'll be getting my more general election assignment. So I'm excited about that. But yeah, I just also wanted to add, because I said earlier that I applied on the Joe Biden website, but I just wanted to add that if you are interested in this campaign or whatever candidate, I would definitely recommend looking into the state party specifically, and that's the best way to get involved right now.
Yeah, and the state part, it's a good point, Rachel, because that's where they're doing get out the vote efforts in obviously on the battleground states at the presidential level, but there are key races in almost every state across the country that people are working on. And on the convention, the states send people out to conventions too, and there are good opportunities and places to get involved.
One thing Paul, you mentioned earlier is kind of like the intensity of a campaign. I think one thing that I didn't know that I wish I had known when I was still in college is working in a campaign headquarters over the summer is a lot less of a fast-paced environment than either working in a campaign headquarters during the fall or working in the field at any time. I was in headquarters all three, both on the Hillary campaign, on the Northam campaign, and the Brindisi campaign. And the sort of like level of intensity was probably the lowest for the governor's race in the summer, because it was basically just like fundraising. There was like very little knocking on doors happening in the state that summer, just the way that the dynamics of the race worked. And there were a couple of people who were students at DC schools who basically stayed on the campaign through the November election, and they sort of talked about how much more how much more fun they had, honestly, like, you know, getting out of the office more because there were more, like, for example, we sort of staffed fundraising events because we were fundraising interns. There were only a couple that we went to over the summer, but like in the fall, it was like there was one every weekend. And like that was sort of, you know, you're kind of in the car more, driving around different places with your fellow interns, like that. So that's something to keep in mind is if you're looking for a fast-paced environment for a summer internship, get out there. Don't, especially if it's not a presidential race. Don't think that you're going to kind of you're going to be in an office most of the time if it's a gubernatorial race or a local race in the summer. I think that's, at least in my experience, that's what I've learned.
Yes, I see a question.
Yeah, I was just wondering, because you mentioned like having fundraising events and going to the office and things like that. How do you think campaigns are going to change given that so much is virtually run now? And do you think that's going to stay in the future? Like, if I'm based in Georgia, still be able to work on a New York campaign, even in a year or two from now? Are they still going to have more positions that are remote?
Rachel, I think you might have more insight into like how the virtual thing's working now with campaigns. So.
Yeah, sure. I get this question all the time, and every time I say that I don't have a perfect answer. Something, at least for us, even, you know, we say even if there's a vaccine tomorrow, like we're still going to have a virtual campaign going on as well. We've learned so much from this experience. We're able to reach so many different voters in rural places that we might not necessarily go. We're able to have speakers speak to voters that might not normally happen. So I think campaigns are going to change because of how we're trying to work through this virtual world. But like, you know, but I know that there always are remote positions. So, you know, people, you know, you could be in Georgia working for a New York race, I think in a few different positions. For me, it's a lot of, you know, actually being on the ground, actually being a face of the campaign at community meetings. And so that's a little bit of a difference. But, you know, I would say that there's always going to be, you know, a virtual world. And, you know, I see a lot of things changing personally. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like, you know, there were when I worked for NARAL, summer of 2017, which was sort of, I did that in the evenings after working for the Northam campaign, you know, a couple nights a week, and it was paid position, so you just sort of made some money. What we were doing was sitting in the office, and we all sat in like a little circle basically, and we just like texted people asking if they wanted to donate to NARAL from our phones, and like we never went outside. And so like things like that were already happening years ago. And so I think the infrastructure is there. It's just like, it is going to be weird to sort of, I'm sure that campaigns are figuring this out, like how they're going to, like, I'm thinking about this, like if I wanted someone to help me out with some stuff, it would probably all be virtual for my campaign, you know. The infrastructure is there. It's just sort of like figuring out how to like keep the sort of important, you know, like people want to feel like they're included and that like they're doing something meaningful, and sort of, you know, like I know with some of the local races in DC, like they were hosting as many virtual town halls as possible, probably more than they would have with supporters, just to sort of make sure that everyone kind of felt like they had an ability to kind of log in and talk to the candidate, you know, because they probably wouldn't run out and meet them in person like they normally would. But at the same time, like things are still happening in person in DC. Like I ran into one of the candidates for one of the November elections in line at the grocery store. She asked me to sign a petition in, you know, physically, but she had like a little QR code. So if you wanted, you could take a photo and sign it online. So people are getting creative. Yeah.
That's a good question. I think that, you know, you started on a campaign at home, and I'm sure they'd have a role for you. But as we wrap up, I will say that most of the campaigns, there's a need for people, we used to call a 72-hour program, and runs from about Friday afternoon to when polls close on Tuesday on November 3rd. And there'll be opportunities, if you call state parties, call and get involved with local candidates. And that's a lot of fun. And that's an intense period right before, you know, again, there's going to be a lot of online and then voting by mail, but it'll still be an important time to be involved. So you can look at that period as well, just to get involved if you're tight on time.
GOTV, I think, is how I'd refer to it. But I plan on just driving to Pennsylvania with some of my friends, who are kind of politically involved on Friday before the election, and just being there for 3 days, sleeping wherever we can, and just I think everyone in the country should do that if they can, whether they're interested in campaigns or not, before the election.
So I think that's a good point for us to end on. And well, I will just say that Rachel, Andrew, and I will be happy to follow up with you and talk about, again, specific races or something, the way to get involved, or if you want to help, some help reaching alumni in this network, we're happy to do it, as are the folks at Colgate. So thank you all very much, and thanks to the folks at Colgate for setting this call up. We wish you all a good summer, and we hope you're back on campus. I like to get up to campus in the fall, and I would like to go to Hamilton and have students there. So good luck with that. Anything else we can do?
I was just going to say thank you all. We will be sending out a follow-up email with the recording of this session for you to watch again if you need to refer back, and we'll give instructions on how to follow up with Andrew and Rachel and Paul too. So thank you all for coming. Let us know if you have any questions, and hopefully we'll see you all soon. Thank you to everybody.
Take care, everyone. Have a good afternoon.
Thanks.
Thank you.